Okay, hopefully this is working. So if people were not able to join us, or your board members are not able to join us, we are recording this. It'll be available possibly as soon as tomorrow, but definitely early next week. So welcome to Views from the Capitol. I am Jennifer Smith, Director of Government Relations for MASB.
I'm Mitch Albers, Assistant Director of Government Relations at MASB.
And so today we just wanted to sort of recap the governor's State of the State address. She tried to set a very positive tone throughout her address, talked about bipartisanship, working together, and that we were going to address two major crises in Michigan: infrastructure and education and skills. So we're going to sort of go through her major points of the speech. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat box and we'll answer them as we go. And I will turn it to Mitch to get us started.
Yeah, I'm going to start by talking about the crises of infrastructure that she laid out in the state of Michigan. This is really a two-pronged infrastructure crisis that she laid out, the first of which is Michigan's roads, which she mentioned were rated as an overall D+, and our roads are a D-, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. And she mentioned that the incremental funding shifts that the legislature has done over the past 6 or 8 years have really not done anything to improve our roads, but have only stopped only slowed their decline. And she wanted to take a complete new look at how those funding mechanisms have been in place, and also what new funding can be used to go forward. And that's where it kind of brought a concern to us, as there's been a rumor that's been going around even since late last year that they may look to shift away the sales tax that we currently collect on gasoline and make it a full gas tax that would go directly towards roads, which may sound logical off the top of your head, but when you think about what the sales tax actually does and how much of it actually goes towards the school aid fund, this would be a significant hit to the school aid fund, especially in a time where the governor has also identified an education crisis, which Jen will go through in just a second. But we would be losing nearly $600 million of school aid fund revenue with this shift, and that would be just a drastic hit to the school aid fund, especially when added to changes that happened in last legislature, and likely changes that they'll look to try to implement this legislative session. And so between the two, we just cannot continue to pick away at the school aid fund and expect that it's going to be there to provide the necessary increases our buildings and our students and our teachers need going forward, with all of the ideas that she is the new governor has laid out going forward in her administration. On the other side of that infrastructure crisis dealt with water, specifically lead and PFAS contamination. She didn't provide as much detail as what she was, kind of her plan going forward on this, but more of a overview of, I know these crises exist and we are going to address them, and noting that this infrastructure is harming all Michigan residents, and that while we have seen in the past the legislature take incremental measures to try to address this, including legislation that's been introduced to require schools to test and remediate their water supply if it has lead or chemicals in it, but there's never any money attached to it. So if we do see those come up again, we need to know that there's going to be dollars attached to provide the schools the necessary revenue to actually be able to make those remediations and even those tests, because some of those tests are up in the thousands of dollars to perform on your water supply, and that can just be for one source. And so we can't be placing more financial burdens on schools outside of the classroom while expecting more from teachers inside and administrators inside the building.
So then she switched gears to education and spoke first of the third grade literacy issue in Michigan, and that third graders in Michigan rank in the bottom 10 in our country in literacy. But then she went on from there to talk about why that is a problem, but that it is not the children's fault. It is not the students' fault. It's not the teacher's fault. It's not that any of them aren't trying to learn or trying to teach. It's because, as she said, a generation of leadership has failed them. She also spoke to repeatedly rating the school aid fund to use it for other sources. She didn't mention higher ed and community colleges by name, but those are obviously two of the biggest raids we've seen on the school aid fund. So she talked about how we need to address this education crisis, and we can't do it without funding, and that the funding we have now undermines what we're trying to do in our schools. She also went on to talk about a skills gap, and she covered that again a little bit later in the speech. And then one of the bigger pieces she talked about that led into her next piece was the idea that we're not respecting our teachers and our educators, and that our educators are just as dedicated as they were before, but they need that support from the legislature and from the state in order to be able to do their jobs properly.
And she believed that this kind of then piggybacked into another point she made about state employee morale. She mentioned that when she came in, there were people that had worked in departments for decades that had never even met the governor, let alone, had felt that their opinions or their work had been really, useful to the state. And so that was really driving down morale in the department. She also mentioned the lack of an understaffing, lack of diversity, and just overall low morale and outdated technology and IT challenges, which have been rampant throughout the state and through the state departments, and really makes it difficult for these employees to do their jobs. And when they do have made updates to IT and technology changes, their rollouts are often clunky and not well explained to those staffers, and that again just drives the morale lower and lower. And so she wanted to kind of build that morale back up, and some of her initial executive directives kind of built into that with her transparency and government theme that she then rolled into, which she talked about all of her different executive directives that she's rolled out so far, starting with her idea to expand FOIA, calling on the legislature to expand FOIA to the executive branch and legislative branch. The House has actually already introduced a package on this, which are House Bills 4007 to 4016. Which would expand FOIA to the executive branch and create a new Legislative Open Records Act for the legislature, which would be similar to FOIA, although there are a few technical differences in those programs. Other things that she was looking to have done and has done to improve employee morale and improve transparency in government were prohibiting the use of personal emails when you're conducting state business, as well as banning the state government from discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and calling on the legislature to expand Elliott-Larson's to make sure that applies both to state and private industry as well, and trying to make sure that all employees are treated equal, both in the workplace, and in the state workplace and the private workplace. And those are ideas that she has to kind of build morale in her departments, as well as build morale throughout the state.
So then she switched back to the skills gap and talked about post-secondary attainment, and that Michigan is one of only 9 states in the country and the only state in the Midwest to not have a formal goal of post-secondary credentialing for the adult population. So currently for Michigan, between ages of 16 to 64, we are at 44% of people have some sort of post-secondary credential. She wants to raise that to 60% by 2030. As with a lot of the pieces in her budget, there's not a lot of detail as to how she wants to get there, but that is her goal, is to have 60% post-secondary credentialing by 2030. She then went on to talk about how career paths used to be ladders and now they're more like rock climbing, and she wants to make sure that everyone has the tools to do that. And to do that, she has named 3 different scholarship type programs that she would like to start. The first is aimed at displaced workers or those already in the workplace that want to change careers. It's called the Michigan Reconnect. And this would create programs and tie those workers to them to train adults in high demand areas and allow them to attain a certificate or an associate's degree in high demand areas. She's modeling this after a program that came out in Tennessee a year or so ago that they have seen really good response from. The second one would be called the Michigan Opportunity Scholarship. And this would give scholarships to allow qualified high school students to attend community college for free for 2 years. So this is the first step in making community colleges free for all and access for all. And then the third one is a different part of the Michigan Opportunity Scholarship, but this would be for university-bound students. And it would give tuition assistance for 2 years for high school students who maintained a B average and attend a public university in Michigan. Now, she named these 3 things to help bolster those post-secondary credentials and the number of people in Michigan that have them. But while there was detail behind what she wants the scholarship to be, there's no detail behind where the money will come from for those scholarships. So we're waiting to hear more about that.
And then one of the last big topics she talked about were the environment and climate change. And we already talked somewhat on the environmental piece, especially with the PFAS entering, going through water throughout the state of Michigan. We've heard people, having issues with that, and including school districts as well. But she talked about the creation of the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, which was tasked with ensuring all Michiganders have access to safe and clean drinking water, and safeguarding the Great Lakes, and included a new office for Clean Water Public Advocate and the Environmental Justice Public Advocate. Just before we got on to air today, though, the Senate finalized HCR 1, passing it on a partisan vote, which disapproved of creating this new department. And so we are at this time, the new department and that new guidance that she's been offering that department is on hold until the governor can kind of regroup and see where she wants to go from that. And while and this was obviously a partisan vote. The Republicans mentioned this isn't so much about their concerns about, they do believe that everybody should have safe access to drinking water. This was more on some commissions that were created last session by the Republican-led legislature and signed by the Republican governor that gave industry stakeholders a greater voice over rules that were developed by the DEQ and what many believed was a unfair access to government by lobbyists and industry stakeholders that would be detrimental to the environment as a whole. And the governor thought that she was going to be advancing forward this prospect of, kind of making sure that the environment was taken care of, more importantly than, maybe listening to some of the industry stakeholders at a ground level. And so with that being disapproved, it's unclear on where that will go forward. And I'm sure that the governor will be looking at steps that she can take to still protect the drinking water in Michigan as well as the Great Lakes. And then one other piece she did mention was that she has joined Michigan to the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a bipartisan group of 20 states that have met to try to reduce greenhouse emissions to meet the Paris Climate Accords goals.
So she wrapped up her speech in a very folksy way. She spoke of all 4 leaders and their families to make the point that we're all families in Michigan and we're all in this together. She came back to her theme of building bridges between the parties, and that the enemy is not the person across the aisle from you, but it's apathy and self-interest. That her goal is to work in a bipartisan way to address some of these crises in Michigan and to make Michigan a better state. She wants to give tools to address the literacy crisis. She expects that to be in her budget. And that her one takeaway was that divided government doesn't have to mean gridlock. And she wants Michigan to be a model to the nation that we can get along when there is a Democrat governor and a Republican House and Senate, or vice versa, depending on the state. She will come out with her budget in about 2 weeks, and that's where we're going to get a lot more detail. We knew going into this speech it was going to be a 10,000-foot view of what she was looking for the next year or into her term. And she even said in her speech that the budget, when it comes out in the first week of March, will be where the rubber hits the road. I see there's one question already about, was there a price tag provided for the cost of those scholarships I mentioned, or will that wait until the budget is out? And there were no price tags on anything she gave during the State of the State speech. So all of that will probably show up in her budget. We also didn't hear things about how we're going to address the education funding crisis or the model that she's going to use for funding schools. All of that, again, we expect in her budget presentation, which is tentatively scheduled for March 5th. So at that point, we'll get a lot more detail about everything she's laid out in this speech, how she expects to pay for it, where her funding priorities are. And then, of course, it's up to the legislature to tear it apart and come up with something totally different. But the process will all start when the governor presents that budget. That's sort of a highlights of what she talked about. Are there questions or other stories you may have heard or things that we didn't cover that you want to know more about? You can put whatever your question is in that chat box. If you type it in there, then we can read it and answer it for you. There's people typing, we're not just staring at you. Is there any response from the legislature about working in a bipartisan way going forward? There was a lot of response in the beginning. We heard a lot from her swearing in that they were going to work in a bipartisan manner and they were all going to be friendly and this was going to last at least until State of the State. As Mitch mentioned, they turned down her executive order to reorganize the environmental department. And that was done on the day her State of the State was originally scheduled to be given. So they kept their promise, technically. We have heard, watching body language and some of the comments that came out of Speaker Chatfield and Leader Shirkey, I do believe there will be an attempt. She has restarted quadrant meetings, so the leaders from the House and the Senate in both parties and her, they meet on a regular basis. And we have seen that work in the past. These quadrant meetings have not happened in many, many years, but they used to happen regularly. And that does seem to build a relationship that makes the bipartisanship a little easier. But a lot of it, we're still really early. So a lot of it we're waiting to see. I've heard rumors that there is a push to undo the recent legislation that included charters in the county enhancement millages. Do you know if there's any truth to this? I have not heard rumors to undo it.
I haven't seen anything at this time, and nor really heard much talk of the legislature looking to undertake that. I know that there are some districts that really would like to see some changes to that. That was, that was just implemented last year, and so I know there are a lot of groups that would like to see that repealed. But at this time, I don't think either of us have heard anything about actually having that even introduced, let alone its chances of getting through this legislature at this time.
The only thing that I've heard even dealing with that may come up is how it's presented on the ballot. So currently when you put it on the ballot, you have to list all of the districts that will benefit from the enhancement millage. And if we add charters, you have to list every single charter that will benefit from that enhancement millage. That went through the House last time. It did not get out of the Senate. The idea was to shorten ballots. We looked at Wayne County when this was going through, and when they renew their enhancement millage, they will have to list all of the charters as well as the districts. That question alone will be one page of the ballot. So that's about the only thing we've really heard of, but we do know that there are districts that would like to get rid of that. I would say in the current legislature, you're not going to see it move.
Any other questions for us?
Okay, well, if you think of anything when this is over, please feel free to contact us. I would like to take a moment to thank Mitch for all the work he has done for us over the last year or so. He will be leaving us next week to start a job as Deputy Legal Counsel in the Michigan House for the Democratic Caucus. So while we're excited, we are sad for MASV, but we wish him well. And so if you run into him, feel